Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on land restoration at scale. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is part of a series of webinars being organized by UNEP with several partners, including Development Alternatives and my own organization, the Nature Conservancy. My name is Priya Shyamsundar. I'm lead economist with the Nature Conservancy, and I will be serving as your moderator today on this very important discussion on how to restore India's lands and how to do this at scale. Before we get to our experts today, just some quick housekeeping. I would request all the participants to please keep your microphone muted. You might have been muted, just keep it muted. I would request all the speakers to keep your microphones muted until you're speaking, and to please put your video cameras on when you are speaking. Let you know that there will be an audio recording of the webinar. The audience, please note that there is a Q&A session. So I would request you to, as you're listening to the speakers, just type in your questions into the chat screen, and then we'll gather them and try to address as many as we can, or let you send an email later. Also, there will be an agenda. There will be a group picture at the end. I'm not going to discuss the agenda in detail because somebody will put it on the chat screen for me. But let's not waste any more time. We start with UNEP's welcome by Mr. Atul Bagai, the head of UNEP. And we will then have a keynote presentation and a panel discussion, and then a closing brief talk. So Atul, can I request you to join us and give your welcome?
Thank you, Priya. And I would, on behalf of UNEP and our co-organizers, TNC and Development Alternatives, would like to welcome all the participants for this webinar. As Priya said, UNEP, on the occasion of the World Environment Day, decided to have a series of nature, centering around nature, some webinars on some of the key issues. And we've brought together about 15 partners. And over a period of 6 months, we would be organizing about 10 webinars around ecosystem and biodiversity and nature. It also fits in well with the super year of nature, and also with the onset of the decade of ecosystem restoration, which starts on 1st January 2021. India, of course, is being now recognized as a pioneer and a front runner on a lot of conservation issues, and at present hosts 2 presidencies of 2 very important COPs, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and also the Convention on Migratory Species. And I think these presidencies are certainly at an opportune moment when we are trying to focus in this present pandemic on nature and nature-based solutions. We are very happy to have a very illustrious panel today, and we are really honored to have Mr. Satya S. Tripathi, the UN Assistant Secretary General and head of UNEP's New York office, giving us the keynote today, followed by a panel which consists of Dr. Pradeep Monga, the Deputy Executive Secretary of UNCCD, Dr. Archana Godbole, Founder Director of Applied Environmental Research Foundation, and Dr. Ajay, Emeritus Scientist of Space Application Center, Indian Space Research Organization. And then, of course, we have the closing remarks by Dr. Ashok Khosla, founder of Development Alternatives and President of International Union for Conservation of Nature. I think such an esteemed panel, and with a keynote to set the tone by Mr. Tripathi, we are looking forward to some very fruitful discussions, and we have a good audience today. And I think we would be able to touch on some of the very key issues that are being faced not only by India, but by the whole world from a perspective of the increasing desertification. I welcome you all for this webinar, and would hand over now to Priya to take forward the agenda.
Um, Thank you, Atul. You know, without any further ado, let me invite Mr. Satya Tripathi to give us our keynote on land restoration and how we can do this at scale. He tells me it's one of his favorite topics. So welcome, Satya. Take it away.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you, colleagues. And uh, I would like to start by thanking Atul and Ashok for their leadership in bringing all of us together. And greetings to Ashok as well. I can see him on the screen. And he's someone we take great inspiration from in our work around the world, both as a former UNEP colleague in the founding days of UNEP, but also in his current roles in very many hats that he wears. So I would spend a bit of time on the challenge and the opportunity. I wear a few hats in my role at the UN as well. Apart from heading the New York office of UNEP, I also head what is called the Environment Management Group. I'm the secretary of EMG, which is a structure put in place by the General Assembly nearly 20 years ago. And what it does is it does two things. One is build coherence in terms of our internal practices, that the UN practices what it preaches the rest of the world, otherwise it sounds hollow. So building consistency and coherence in terms of what we do internally. So we have the Sustainable UN program that makes sure that our carbon footprint is as good as it ought to be. Of course, it's something in the works for a while, and we'll continue to soldier on, but it's not easy, as any massive organization leaders will tell you. The other thing it does is that make sure that we're all speaking in one voice on issues of critical importance to the planet as they pertain to the environment, whether it is sand and dust storms, whether it is biodiversity, whether it is e-waste. So I could go on and on. The EMG works at the forefront of these ideas and these challenges, and comes up with collective solutions that the world can use. So in that role as well, I get to work a lot with all the UN agencies, funds and programs, and it is quite inspiring to see what all the UN agencies are doing in terms of mainstreaming biodiversity into our collective conscience as it relates to land restoration. And why is land restoration my favorite subject? Because for the best of reasons, everything happens in a context and a time and a place. So taking the case of India, we went into this green revolution, which was fantastic. For the time it came about, it fed hundreds of millions of people. It prevented starvations and food security and nutrition challenges. So we must all be extremely grateful for what it did in those areas. But what it also did is that the evidence just keeps piling up. 60 years on, you can clearly see that it hasn't done us much good in terms of soil fertility, in terms of soil organic carbon, in terms of the productivity of the land, the limited land that we have, uh, in terms of population to land ratio. India has pretty much like it's a multiple of 8 as compared to the land it has and the population it feeds. And it is really, really difficult to be productive unless you are imaginative. And of course, India is the largest producer of a lot of agricultural producers, and we can take heart from that. But it is also a fact that we import a lot. And it's a constant battle as far as the farmer is concerned to just make ends meet. And in that context, India's role in meeting this challenge itself and in leading the world is quite significant in the context of the superior for nature, as Atul mentioned. And why is that so? Because we currently, and in terms of a business model, what is happening is that agriculture is heavily subsidized. And of course, you got to subsidize it because you got to keep your population fed and nourished. And let me just talk a bit about the subsidies. The fertilizer subsidies amount to roughly 95,000 crores per annum. And then if you look at different states and the crop development schemes and the subsidies they provide, they run into easily another 40,000 crores. If you look at the rural farming electricity subsidies that state governments provide, in most cases it is free, thereby further accentuating the challenge of land degradation, because when it is free, then you keep pumping all water out without bothering about conserving anything. And that itself would easily run into 25 to 30,000 crores, depending on the year we're talking about, and how good agriculture has been on a particular year, or how dry the season has been. So, and then you add on top of that the political cycle of farm loan waivers. The farm loan waivers are, of course, made necessary by a vicious circle of lack of investment in soil health and land fertility, but it manifests itself in the political cycles where every political party literally runs to financial institutions that it has any control over to make sure that there are farm loan waivers promised and delivered. So that is now a major political promise come elections, whether it is state elections or national elections. I'm not the person to judge whether it is right or wrong. That's for the political leaders of any country, and more so India, to take that call. But as an economist, I can tell you with near certainty that it distorts markets. It creates perverse expectations, and it doesn't help the cause. And the policymakers also know that, but they are confronted with a situation which will be a classic Hobson's choice. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And then that runs into hundreds of thousands of crores if you aggregate all the farm loan waivers that happens across the spectrum. That you don't need me to tell you that it is an unsustainable arrangement, no matter which way you look at it. We keep pouring more and more money, distorting the whole credit mechanism, while persevering with an arrangement that keeps degrading the land and destroying soil health. So the case here is this, that if we are spending all of this money, should we not look at it, that if that money could be alternatively used, what could it do? An example could be the work that is happening on zero budget natural farming. Some people call it Subhash Palekar natural farming. Some call it community managed natural farming, the process of bioinoculation, and which brings down, and UNEP has been involved in supporting in a strong way under Atul's leadership, the work that is happening now in Andhra Pradesh, where in 2018, the then Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, announced that Andhra Pradesh would like to convert all its 6 million farmers to zero chemical farming. And this is something that then there was an MOU between UNEP funded and UNEP facilitated the Sustainable India Finance Facility and the government of Andhra Pradesh. And that work continues. And as of today, they have converted about 1 million farmers. And going by what they have spent and how the mechanism works there, they spend roughly about $365 a person in terms of building capacity, motivation, creating the demonstration pilots, and helping convert people to natural farming. And if you extrapolate that number to 6 million farmers, it still works out to roughly $2.5 billion, adding in the training component as well. That's not a lot of money. That's roughly about 20,000 crores. And that you can easily manage, because even if you take the case of Andhra Pradesh alone, that state easily spends 10,000 crores a year on all kinds of different subsidies, including fertilizer subsidies that of course comes from the central government, but then there's electricity subsidies and what have you, and interest subvention schemes for farmers. So if you add up everything, it's easily 10,000 crores a year. And so that's, you can actually, if you can solve that problem, you have the resources. Because often in the international fora, as every speaker will tell you today, that there are great ideas, there are great minds at work, there are great opportunities to be capitalized upon, but there are little resources available. Take the case of the current promise and the delivery. The countries of the world, the countries of the global north promise the countries of the global south that we will put in place $100 billion arrangement by 2020. We are already almost at the end of 2020. Every year for countries to be able to meet their climate obligations, because that's how the Paris Agreement came about, that there were expectations, there were promises, and that's how Paris Agreement came about. Now, talking about the Paris Agreement, even if it were fully implemented, it will be 3.2 degrees of global warming, not 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And even that 3.2 degrees, there's little evidence. Of course, India is meeting its commitments under Paris Agreement, and there are a few other countries. But then there are those that also criticize the group of countries that are meeting their obligations by saying, hey, you know, maybe you promised too little, which may or may not be the fact, but this is the kind of conversation that is going on. Against the backdrop of that, if you take GEF, which is the Global Environmental Facility, and the Green Climate Fund, the two of them, GEF has garnered about $17 billion in resources since its founding. That's roughly 27 years. And GCF about 10 billion. So that's the cumulative amount. So there is no 100 billion, and that's not happening. So countries really have to sit up and look within and find both the inspiration and the resources within the envelopes they have. And India, in that case, stands as a shining example of what is possible. And in this, I want to recognize the work being done by the Ministry of Agriculture under Minister Tomar, and the Planning Commission, more popularly known as the National Institution for Transforming India, Niti Aayog Vice Chairman Dr. Rajiv Kumar. Together, they are looking at how we can change the equation in India. And the equation in India is that it has 160 million hectares of farmland and about 140 million smallholder farmers. And so if you can solve that problem, you are really talking about land restoration at system scale. And that will not just a shining example for India and its people for switching from soil chemistry to soil biology and changing the whole economic equation there, but also for the world, for the countries of the world, for the people of the world to learn from India and do what is right, which is to shun chemicals to the extent we can and embrace soil health as quickly as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tripathi. That was a wide-ranging presentation on what the challenges are, including all the subsidies that many countries have put in place, including India, and where the opportunities are emerging. So there's reason for hope there. I think if you don't mind waiting for the Q&A so we can have the panel and then jump into Q&A for you as well as others on the panel. I'm sure the audience has questions for Mr. Tripathi, so just please put them on the chat box.
I will have to stay on, Priya, because I have to listen to my good friend Ashok when he wraps up.
Okay, excellent. I'm so glad. So you can wait for the Q&A then. So I'd like to ask our audience to react to this speech by putting your questions in the chat box, please. But now let me move on to the panel, panel of experts that we have today. We have a panel that will be discussing various aspects of land restoration, certainly to some extent globally, but also in India. We're hoping that the panel will pick up on different considerations such as policy reforms. Dr. Tripathi just referred to some of these, What are some considerations in India? Financial considerations. Where can we bring markets in? What are our opportunities that may be provided through advanced technologies? And what kinds of new institutions do we need to be thinking about to really not just restore lands, but to restore lands at scale? And I think that's the pivotal issue. How do we get this done at scale? So let me invite, we have several panelists, but let me first invite Dr. Pradeep Ponga. He is Deputy Executive Secretary at the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD, and he brings a very global perspective on the role of markets and the private sector in land restoration. So Pradeep, would you like to speak? I would like to request our panelists to restrict their comments to 5 to 7 minutes. So thank you, Pradeep.
So thank you, Priya. Thank you, Satya, for setting the context in your opening remarks and keynote address. From UNCCD side, let me try to begin with giving you some global context. As we speak today, around 25% of global land area, which is almost 2 billion hectares of productive land, is degraded, out of which 500 million hectares are almost abundant agricultural land or degraded land. The more challenging is every year, 12 million plus hectares of productive land is getting degraded for various reasons. I'll come to that later on. But because of this degraded land, we feel that almost 1.3 billion people are trapped. I mean, poverty and degraded lands go hand in hand together. And we believe that partially there are many reasons for that, including, of course, unsustainable production and consumption pattern. For instance, consumption of natural resources have doubled almost in 30 years. And if we really look at our population growth by 2050, or 9 billion plus, we will need at least 3 planets to meet natural resource demand, including food security for everyone there. We, according to UN and some partners' reports recently, almost 135 million people have been displaced in last 2 decades, especially due to land degradation, drought, and of course, desertification. And here the challenge comes that land sector, which can also very important for the sink, but also act for the emission side, accounts for 25% of total carbon emissions. Of course, on the financing side, at the global level, International Resource Panel estimates that we need to restore around 350 million hectares per year by 2030 to meet global targets, to make this world land degradation neutral. And of course, a conservative estimate, we put $100 per hectare to $500, a $300 per hectare will be to restore land per hectare we require almost $100 billion per year between now and 2030. Like Satya already mentioned, major drivers of land degradation are, of course, unsustainable agriculture practices, but we can club it with deforestation, drought, unplanned urbanization, land use changes, of course, unsustainable patterns of production, consumptions, and climate change. And that's where the concept of land degradation neutrality, which is part of SDG 15.3 comes in. And to begin with, we are trying to see how we can avoid this 12 million hectares of land which is getting degraded every year, especially the productive land. And that's where we really can avoid, reduce, and reverse land degradation through sustainable land use and management practices and approaches. Now coming to Indian context specifically, paradoxically coming from India myself, I never realized that land was so important. Land restoration was so important for India in overall perspective. Imagine India has 18% of global population, 1.3 billion people plus, but land area is 2.4% only. And out of that 2.4% roughly translates to 328 million hectares. 1/3, 100 million hectares plus are degraded land. So when we talk about food security, water security, energy security, ecosystem services for India, to really make this 100 million hectares becoming productive again becomes very relevant for India because of so many reasons, social, economic, and of course, environmental side, including food security, water conservation, etc. We had Conference of Parties 14. We were very happy and would like to thank Ministry of Environment, Forest and Government of India and other agencies, including UN system, to really host this COP14 in India last year, September, where at the concluding session, high-level segment, Prime Minister of India, Shri Modi ji, announced 26 million hectares of land will be restored by 2030 or even earlier. The challenge is even earlier. But when we translate into terms of money-wise or funding-wise, if we put $300 per hectare, we are almost talking about $7 to $8 billion. So roughly $1 billion plus every year should be targeted to restore the degraded land. The challenge comes, and of course, Satya briefly mentioned towards that, how to bring in the private sector. And that's where the challenge comes. What kind of smart policies we feel? And what are the challenges when we talk about land restoration? We are almost talking about land restoration projects are small when we talk about small farmers or those communities vulnerable. So returns are low, risks are high. And that's where we feel that ownership, community ownership, the tenure system, the gender issues, especially women ownership, not only in India, worldwide. That is one of the main hurdles in restoring the land in rural areas, because unless the ownership is passed on and the rules and policies are very clear. Fortunately, in India, land reform systems have worked very well. But on the other hand, still, I think longer distance to go there very clearly. More importantly, how do we really bring private sector on board, especially on public-private partnerships? Two challenges I feel. One is land agenda is still very fragmented. It is dealt in silos. There's so many ministries involved in the center level, national level, state level, and the district level. And because of so many rules, policies, and of course, regulations in place, we cannot target what kind of smart policies we can bring in. So how we can bring in integration and of course, Niti Aayog and some other Ministry of Agriculture, Land Resources are working towards that with Ministry of Environment. But the challenge remains, we need to have integrated smart policies for that to trigger in private sector investment. The secondly, we believe that we can also have private sector coming in on low-hanging fruit. As of now, we speak 5 million hectares abundant mining land. I mean, it's not a brainer when mining sector is so rich in financing when they really mine it, including coal. But when they abandon it, why it cannot be restored? Why that funds cannot be put in place in first place? That land restoration is part of such projects, whether it's minerals or other mining sector. And that is what we call land degradation neutrality. CSR, corporate social responsibility, we hear all sort of things, including renewable energy getting a lot of attention in India, but land restoration, greening the deserts, not getting right kind of tools. Third area is technologies. I think India is one of the few countries which have very high level of human resource expertise, space technology and others, but we are not using some of the very cutting edge, including drones and others for planting millions of those desertified lands. But we have seen, especially in China and many parts of the world, things are happening. Fortunately, green cover is increasing in India. Forestry is showing plus side in last 10 years. But I do feel that we have to move extra mile towards when we talk about restoring land, degraded lands, especially if we can focus on this 26 million hectares. On the financing side, one of the biggest challenge remains that there is no targeted smart funding. At the global level, UNCCD has been instrumental in setting up of land degradation neutrality fund. It is one of the first SDG impact transformative fund set up with governments and partners, managed by Mirova, one of the private managers, investment managers, and that is already almost capitalized for $150 million, already given projects and programs. I do believe from UNCCD side that India needs a dedicated financing mechanism. Can be NABARD, can be any other national institutions. We need not have new institutions because that will not work out. Economies of scale should work. We must have targeted financing for private sector to come in with right kind of policies, knowledge management, and capacity building, where CSOs and international NGOs present in India can play a very important role on capacity building and knowledge management. Let me just conclude from UNCCD perspective. When we talk about land restoration, we are not only talking about food, water, energy security, or ecosystem services. We are talking about jobs, We are talking about doubling the income of farmers, especially small farmers. Like for instance, for 26 million hectares, if they get restored, we are almost talking about 4 to 5 million jobs directly or indirectly coming in. 2 jobs for 10 hectares, so around 2.6 million direct jobs, and the indirect jobs could be in the same size. So we are talking about almost 5 million jobs being created in rural areas if this degraded land get restored. And one of the programs being launched as a part of COP14 in India, what we call India Legacy Program, which may not cover all states, all hotspot states in India, but at least it will cover important states like Gujarat, Haryana, Rajasthan, Delhi, and of course part of surroundings of Delhi, what we call green paths from Gujarat towards Aravali restoration and others, what we are aiming at. But it can trigger up the scaling of such initiatives on a long run. So this is in a nutshell from UNCCD side, and of course we believe that a country like India must invest in land if we want to address climate change, biodiversity, but also on the social and economic side. Thank you, Priya.
Thank you, Pradeep. I understand that you may have to leave for a short while, but please put your questions, folks, in the chat box for Pradeep, and we will get them to him. He should hopefully be back, but he will also be on email. So please put your questions in there. Unfortunately, our next speaker, Mr. Jigbet Thakpa, could not join us. He was going to talk to some of these policy issues that have come up. And so I'm going to have to jump into the third speaker on this panel, which is myself. I was asked to address some of the financial considerations that we need to be thinking about for scaling. And while the previous two speakers have mostly talked about land restoration very broadly and have addressed some critical considerations in the agricultural space, my comments will be restricted to another sector, which is forestry. So it's just taking a small piece of the cake and talking about it. Our challenge with land restoration in India and globally is, as Satya so eloquently identified, the fact that land is such a contested resource. There are overlapping systems of formal and informal rights, competing land claims, missing land managers, even if this is the state, lots of common property where people don't feel they have the rights to manage those lands, and partial implementation of laws, and huge opportunity costs tied to alternate land uses. So to restore lands in the face of these challenges, we need some very serious financing. There's just no question. And this is what Pradeep just alluded to. And to do this at scale, financing needs to be both very large and creative. It can't just be the usual sources of money, again, just as Pradeep said. So we need to be thinking about all manners of financial options that make sense, and we need to be very creative about this. So where is this public financing coming? Where is this financing going to come from? In terms of public financing, we generally think about it in three different strategies. One is overseas development assistance, right? We've relied on this significantly. The other is our own national taxes and the revenues that come from taxes. And then there are, of course, these alternate ways in which money is being used, these perverse subsidies that could be reduced so we could increase the cake a little bit more so that we have more to distribute for the right reasons. Globally, public financing for restoration is nowhere near the need of the hour. Recent analysis suggests that especially in the forestry space, overseas development assistance for forestry was something like $1.7 billion per year between 2014 and 2017. This is roughly a 50% reduction from ODA in the previous decade, which is about 3.5 billion per year. So public overseas development assistance is important, but is declining or stagnant and will be wholly inadequate. The data for India suggests a very similar trend. I understand that forestry ODA in India in, say, 2019 was about approximately 30% of what it was at the beginning of the millennium. So major decline. Countries have to sit up, as Satya said, and so they are sitting up, they are leaning in. In India in particular, we've had some very good news. Very recently, the 15th Finance Commission recommended, based on a formula it uses, that the share of tax revenues to states that maintain their forests should be increased. States that are forested, rather, should be increased. The FC, the Finance Commission, uses a weightage that it gives for sort of the horizontal devolution of taxes. And this weight that it gives to states that have dense forests, they increased it in the latest Finance Commission from 7.5% to 10%. So here you see a policy instrument that was actually used in India to secure more financing for the forest sector. This is a very good thing. I think this amounts to something like 185 INR crore for forested states in the 2019-2020 period. So internal financing has increased. The other area where we're seeing more money coming in for financing is through CAMPA, the Compensatory Afforestation Fund and Planning Authority. The CAF Act of 2016, there was a lot of money sitting around in CAMPA, but the CAF Act of 2016 has resulted in CAMPA money being released to the states. For instance, in the 10 years prior to 2019, something like 18,000 plus crores had been released. But last year, just these are estimates, and this may be not, there may be increases from this, but the amount released to something like 27 states was 47,000 plus crores. So a significant leap in the money that is going out from the state, from the center to states in the forestry space for forest land restoration. So the need of the hour, folks, is to focus on these states that are receiving money. The financing is available or has increased, and to channel these funds for land restoration that is optimal and appropriate. Now, let me take the last couple of minutes to focus on another point that Pradeep made. How do you bring the private sector in, and is there private sector money? Is this available? And I think there is some good news in this space as well. Private sector financing can come through investments, and it can come through markets that are purchasing resources that contribute to land restoration. In the investment space, many retirement funds in the US, for example, are interested in long-term returns, and trees offer long-term secure returns where there are policies in place that afford land tenure security and such. But anyway, there's lots of pension funds in the US, for instance, that are interested in investing in forest management and development. There's also a growth in impact investments. These are investments by companies and funds that have the explicit goal of generating both private returns and social returns. This is growing. I just looked this up. There's something like at least 37 funds in the US, Canada, Australia, et cetera, that are managing up nearly $10 billion of forestry and related assets as of now. And this is something that is absolutely growing. So probably not as fast as we'd like it to grow, but it is growing. So there will be private investment money coming in, I think, in the forestry space. And agriculture too, I presume, but I know less about that. Markets. I think particularly there are markets for carbon offsets in the space there. This is the idea to grow trees to store carbon as a natural climate solution. The demand for trees and therefore land restored with trees to store carbon is increasing. It's still very small. It's tiny relative to everything else, but but it's growing. And for example, in the 2016-2018 period, this markets for forest and land use offsets increased by something like 264% relative to very small growth in other types of offsets. So there is interest in the private sector now in offsetting their carbon, and this is a medium-term strategy for mitigating climate. This is nobody saying this is what we absolutely have to do for the long term, but this is a medium-term strategy, and the financing may be useful for forest restoration. So what is the bottom line? From my perspective, we need to be thinking about scale. And so it's really important for us to be thinking about all forms of financing, both public and private. And in the Indian context, we certainly need to be looking at the states to identify state-specific strategies to ensure that the finance that is flowing is channeled in the right direction. So those are my comments about financing. Let me stop there and move on to our next speaker. Again, please put your questions down. Sorry to sort of have this rapid set of speakers, but I am now going to invite Dr. Ajay to talk about technological options and where they may lead us with land restoration. And Dr. Ajay comes to us formally from ISRO.
Yeah. So, good afternoon to everybody who is in India, and good morning to those who are in US and Germany. As I have been told to speak about the
Dr. Ajay, are you muted? We are not hearing you. What happened there? Can you hear me?
I'm able to hear, but
okay, yes. Now I can hear you. You were gone for a while, but I can hear you now. Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So I have been asked to talk about the technology, how the technology can be used in really upscaling the issue of land restoration. As we all know that some of the technologies are also acting as the negative factor and contributing towards the land degradation. But what I am going to talk about some of the technologies which will be really helpful. I will be talking about specifically the technology related to
Again, we seem to have lost you. Please unmute. We could have.
Dr. Priya, he's not muted. He's, I think, not speaking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's fine.
Yeah, now I'm here. There was some issue. So basically, I will be talking about very briefly about two technologies. One is geospatial technology, and the second one is the remote sensing technology. Geospatial technology, when we talk about it, is basically represent the technologies which are used to create, generate, store, analyze, and disseminate the data, spatial data related to natural resources, which also includes the condition of the land. And the second one is the remote sensing technology, which basically provides the images of the Earth from Earth observation satellites at various resolutions. I am sure that you are able to hear me. Yeah. So now when we talk about the land restoration, one of the important issue comes as the India has set the target of 26 million hectares by 2030, the important issue comes that first we need to find out how much area in our country is degraded and where exactly they are located. Unless we are able to pinpoint the degraded area and its spatial location, it's difficult to take any measure. The second important issue is not only just identifying the degraded area, but also to know the current status, that how much is the severity of the degradation, whether it is totally degraded or it is the process is ongoing. The second important information which is required is the what kind of process is really active there, what process of land degradation has really degraded that particular piece of land. Why it is required? Because the treatments, the action for restoration of land is different for different types of land degradation processes. So we need to know not only the area or the land which is degraded, but we also need to know the process by which the land has been degraded. And the third important thing which is required is the severity. See, as I was talking about the different treatments required for different processes, I will just give an example. The treatment required to reclaim the land which is affected by, say, erosion is different from what is required for restoring the land which is affected by salinity or acidification. So that is why we require this information. The next issue comes that if we have to select 26 million hectares, now I'm talking in the perspective of India, if we have to select 26 million hectares, how do we really select? How do we prioritize? India has roughly 1/3, around 100 million hectares under degraded land. So how do we prioritize it so that we can start working on land restoration? And one of the important information which we should consider in terms of prioritizing the land for restoration, that when we get the information from this technology that this particular piece of land is having a certain level of severity. So we need to use that information, and according to my view, we should take up those land for restoration which has not gone to a state or a status which requires huge effort and money, huge effort as well as money. So because the land degraded, there are certain parcel of land which has degraded to that extent that the restoration of such land will require very high effort. So that is where this information provided by geospatial technology is useful in prioritizing the land for taking up for restoration. The second important issue comes when we want to make an action plan to act on the ground, that what kind of action is to be taken on the ground to restore or rehabilitate or arrest the process of land degradation. That is where this technology also comes into picture. When we want to make an action, as I said, it is different for different types of land degradation. So we need information on the present land use. Why we require? Because even for a same process of land degradation, say for example soil erosion, the action required for arresting soil erosion or reclaiming the eroded land in forest will be different from agriculture land. So we require information on land use, we require information on the topography of the area, we also require information on the soil, availability of ground and surface water, and then one has to use the geospatial technology to integrate this information to generate what is called as composite land development unit. Composite land development unit is a homogeneous piece of land having a similar kind of all these parameters. So based on these parameters, for a particular unit, an action plan is decided for reclamation or restoration of the land. So that is where the spatial data comes into picture, the geospatial technology comes into picture. The third important aspect is when we implement these actions. So we also need to what is the impact of these particular actions which has been taken on the ground. whether it has really made any impact in terms of change in the environment, change in the ecology of that area, or change in the ecosystem services provided by that particular land which has been reclaimed. So that is where again these two technologies, the remote sensing based earth observations images as well as geospatial technology comes into picture, and we can use the images of different time frame before implementation of the action and after implementation of the action, analyze in a in GIS environment using geospatial technology, and can find out, yes, whether there is there is any change in the there is a change because of the impact of the implementation of actions plan for restoration. So in brief, I wanted to tell about the use of these two technologies. And as far as India is concerned, in both the technologies, India is very well established. India has launched a series of operational satellites, Earth observation satellites, which are providing data which are used operationally in the country for management of natural resources, and also it has been used for mapping of the degraded land of the entire country, and also monitoring how it is processing. And such information which has been generated by India using our own Indian satellite data also provides information which are required for restoration of the degraded land, as I mentioned about the type of the process as well as the severity of the process. So in my view, if we use this technology, it will definitely help in meeting the challenge which has been meeting the commitment which has been made by India to reclaim, say, that is 26 million hectares. So this is what I wanted to mention very brief about the technology which will be highly useful in really leveraging the action of the land restoration in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ajay. I think that's very clear that we can use this for prioritization, for identifying drivers, and for monitoring and evaluation. And I think these are all very, very important points. I have a question for you, but I will hold this till we finish with our next speaker, Dr. Archana Godbole. Dr. Archana is the founder director of the Applied Environmental Research Foundation, and they've been doing all kinds of innovative work. And let's hear from her on how she's using various creative ways to restore lands. Thank you, Archana, all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Priya. I think it is so good to see so many people, from different walks of life attending and participating in the webinar, because since it has been 5-6 months and most of us are webinared out to some extent, but still I'm happy to see so many participants. We have been discussing quite a lot about, global policies and, what's the outlays at the country level in India, and how we are fighting the combat against the desertification and stuff. And I think many of the speakers, they are eminent economists. I'm not. And I would like to bring everyone to a completely, local situation in India. At Applied Environmental Research Foundation, we have been working in conservation space with the main aim is conservation. And we all know that how land degradation is affecting the biodiversity of the country. I think we have protected area network, but they are not enough, we all know, and they are also facing lots and lots of problems. But if you look at outside protected area network, the issue of land degradation is huge, and we really have very limited understanding to go for restoration and make these areas, beneficial to local communities, because we have been working on the ground for last 25 years, and we have realized one thing, that we need to bring in direct benefits to the communities who are using the resources and who would like to maintain the land and biodiversity for providing free ecosystem services to the users. So how to go about that is a big question, and I will not go into the issues and problems and drivers of deforestation and land degradation, because most of us, we are aware of that. what we've been trying to do in the open access areas from northern parts of Western Ghats. Western Ghats is the mountain range running parallel to the western coast of India. And in south, we have got a lot of protected areas in this biodiversity hotspot, but in the northern part of the Western Ghats hotspot, we have very limited protected area network, and therefore the land is used indiscriminately without much planning by people. I'm talking about land other than agricultural land. So we wanted to figure out, how to provide direct benefits, and we started working with some of the market-based approaches. And we know that we have to do quite a lot of, baseline work and understanding of the resources. I'll not again go into that. But I think our story is around the Fair Wild certification for some of the fruits of forest trees, and how these certification protocols supported for building the capacity of local communities to understand the real value of the resource, build and strengthen the value chains around such species, and ultimately how this whole process has contributed to restoration of traditional cultural spaces like sacred forest and privately owned, unprotected forests, which could have been otherwise clear failed, and therefore could have added to the degraded lands of the country. So we have been working on a couple of species like Terminalia bellerica and Terminalia cebula. Terminalia bellerica is one of the ingredients of Triphylla. It is also used in some of the herbal teas, and we are selling our processed Terminalia bellerica fruits to companies like Pakka Herbs. Many of you from US and Europe especially must have heard about Pakka Herbs. They go for all the ingredients of their herbal teas that are Fair Wild certified. That means the social, ecological, and economical aspects have been taken care of. There is full transparency and accountability in the whole process of how the fruits are collected, how the benefits are shared, and how the biodiversity and conservation has been achieved in the process. So we've been working on Terminalia bellerica fruits. Then we are also working on other value chains like bamboo-based construction material, and also to scaling it up, because we know everybody in rural India used to have the bamboo house, but now that trend has completely changed, and cement, the material that is contributing to climate change, has taken over, and then we need to go back. So how do we make best use of it, and in the process get benefits to the local people? Then we are also working on other species like Acacia catechu, then Pterocarpus marsupium. These are the forest trees, fast growing trees, but again, due to non-transparent supply chains, the tree owners or the people who are maintaining these trees in their forests were not getting enough benefits. So we have built a kind of rotation agroforestry, which is the modification of general agroforestry models, and how it also will be certified so that the end user or the buyer of the medicine or herbal tea will get to know that from where this raw material has come, and how the local person or the indigenous person or the forest dweller or the forest guardian has been benefited out of this business. So we have been doing that for last, say, 10 years. And fortunately, this realization of linking conservation to the businesses and market has come in our mind very early, so that in a sense we are quite ahead in the game, and there are lots of other international corporations and pharmaceutical industries. They are now working with us, and we are developing more products and more transparent value chains, bringing money to people. Then we are also working with some of the corporates who are not only giving enough benefits or more money to the local people who are collecting and processing, but also contributing to conservation, because say community X is saving few sacred groves and from there the material is collected, then over and above the actual cost and extra benefits to the collectors and processors, the money is given to biodiversity management committees for conservation of such spaces. And we have been working in more than say 100 villages with this approach, and we have been benefiting more than a couple of thousand people, and have generated the kind of employment out of all these value chains development. I think it is extremely important to when we are looking at the global situation, global scenario, and what kind of investments are required to really do the restoration. But we also need to have some of the demonstrations, scalable options, and tested, approaches to build on and see how they could be replicated in other similar areas, or how we can learn from each other. All of them, it's not maybe only AERF, but there are other organizations also, who are working and testing such approaches and trying to link to the market-based solutions and nature-based solutions for achieving conservation. And achieving conservation, it means achieving the land restoration, forest restoration, or maintaining whatever we have, and looking at these things. But I think over the period of time, what we have realized, there are two extremely important things. One is you need to have a passion. The idea itself cannot be implemented. So passion is not only the factor that will help you to come up with solutions and scale them up, but hard working with communities, and most importantly, there has to be a continuous flow of investments. And I think Priya talked about how the investments in the conservation space or international conservation funding is reduced globally as well as in India. So there is another window through the CSR, and how the corporations would like to invest in forest conservation or building the value chains. And I'm very happy to say and tell you that the corporations like Credit Suisse, they have been supporting our work for more than 5 years. And I think it takes a lot of time to convince and build the capacity of corporate decision makers and managers at that level, so that they will invest into conservation and land restoration. But once they do, it is very open for you to bring in new ideas and work for implementing those ideas. And that's how I think we can really contribute to the whole process of land restoration, and how others can learn and replicate that elsewhere. Then there are, Priya already talked about that, but I would like to reiterate that there are kind of investments available, like carbon market is there, then building value chains, and conservation trust funds, or impact investment funds, or pension funds. But I think they are still in a at least for people like us, or working at the grassroots levels, it is extremely difficult to reach there and bring them into our space. But I think it's worth trying. Then we also need to look at plantations differently. All of us, we love, and corporates also through their CSR, that they would love to go for plantations, and then we are done with that, and tick mark is done that we have planted like say million saplings. But then a saplings to become a tree, it needs further investment and attention. And who's going to do that, and how we are going to do that, and also, sometimes the jargons and infographics, they mislead, like many of us, we don't believe that India's forest cover is actually increasing. Might be the tree cover or green cover is increasing to some extent, and in some areas, but the deforestation and land degradation is rampant. So it's a multifaceted, issue. where lots and lots of stakeholders are engaged. And I think webinars like this, and I'm sure after the COVID situation is done, we will be working actually together in collaborations and in partnerships to actually contribute to the solutions. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Sushil DA and TNC, for inviting me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Archana. That was very inspiring, and it's so useful to see how solutions are being implemented, because I think this is the need of the day. And the fact that you're able to use markets, which are really, if we want to scale, there's no better aggregator than markets. So all very, very interesting, important work. And that brings us to the end of our panelist presentations. I'd like to now go to our Q&A. And Dr. Khosla, if you sit tight, you will have the last word once we are done here. Lots of interesting questions that have come through the Q&A. Just give me a second here to scroll through these. There was one in particular for Satya that I want to start with. So Satya, this was a question about, which says, what are from, I don't know exactly who it is from, but what are the political factors holding back adoption of chemical-free farming? So this is a larger, I think, question about why, say, for example, in Andhra Pradesh, the work that everybody is speaking about these days, the Andhra example, right? Where are we on the adoption curve? Why is this not going viral? Is it just the $365 per farmer that is the constraint, or is it much more than that? What's the adoption story over here?
I think Andhra's greatest benefit are its women, because the strength are the women, because they have 11.5 million women as part of the self-help groups. So the social mobilization has happened on a different context, and that architecture is available to be tapped into when you are looking at spreading the idea of natural farming. And so that's what is aiding and abetting the swift mobilization of farmers, because it is, as we know, it is mostly women that do the work, even in the farm context. And so they have a significant say in matters of the farming choice, and of course households and everything else. And so that has helped greatly. But more importantly, I think there are two things to mention here in the context of this question. Political help or political championship has been tremendous in Andhra Pradesh. This was started under Mr. Naidu's leadership, but it must go to the credit of Mr. Jagan Reddy that he has championed it even better. He came in, of course, he had every right to relook at everything that was happening under the previous administration, as it happens in any political arrangement, which he did. But then he has embraced it, and embraced it even more strongly. And I think it speaks volumes of the determination of the women farmers that run these self-help groups, and the way they have mobilized themselves. The other thing is that the whole rollout architecture, if I may use that term, because they have adopted a model where a demonstration, like to give you an example, they find champion farmers in the villages that have done this well, and then they hire them at pretty much 3 times the farm wages, and then they take them to a neighboring district, not a neighboring village. You're not coming back home in the evening. You're going and living in another village, quite a distance away, and be there for the entire crop cycle. And actually then befriend farmers in that village, explain to them every evening like a chai pe charcha, and then the community gets together to understand what is happening and why is it happening the way it is. And then of course, next year about 15%, or next crop cycle, depending on if it is irrigated land or rain-fed agriculture, So 15% of the farmers or the land, because farmers don't want to convert everything in one go. And then so next time it is about 50%, and by third crop cycle, it's 100%. And that's how they've done. As of today, yesterday I had a very good discussion with the Principal Secretary of Finance and others on a financing arrangement that we are discussing at this time. And they have 33% of the villages in Andhra Pradesh now have ZBNF. Of course, not everything is 100% converted because they go through at least 3 crop cycles, but they have, so that's how it is happening. So there's political support. There is a social infrastructure available that lends itself to the rollout, and resources as well. The governments have been very kind with the resources in the past. And of course, it is led by Mr. Vijay Kumar, who is also the person that was the key person behind the self-help group movement, or SERP as they called it at that time, and it still is, but he doesn't lead it anymore, but at that time he did. And he was also head of India's National Rural Livelihoods Mission. So he's spent a lifetime championing and experimenting and understanding and appreciating these whole arrangements. And so that helps, because you have a person who really, really understands the power of partnership, not the power of a top-down arrangement, but the power of partnership, working with people at the grassroots. And I think that's what is helping. But talking specifically about the question, I don't think you have much political challenge in India, because the politicians, as you would have it at this time, are actually very keen on natural farming. And that's happening. Himachal Pradesh just announced that they want to follow Andhra's example and convert all their farmers to zero chemical farming. They will have a much bigger challenge because they don't have the same level of social engagement that Andhra Pradesh has, but nothing is impossible. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that what is holding back chemical farming is not the politicians in the Indian context. It is the scientists. And I've had a few conversations with our friends at the National Academy of Agricultural Scientists and others, NAS and others. And then my humble suggestion to them has been, how did you become scientists? Because you questioned everything. That's what differentiates a scientist from a layperson. You don't have blind faith in anything that is peddled to you. You question everything. And that's when you stop doing that, then we lose our objectivity. And so the current ecosystem, as it may, is a chemical agriculture ecosystem, strengthened enormously over the last 6 decades. So when you talk to them about the chemical-free agriculture, the answer you normally get is that, oh, where are the nutrients? Where's the input versus output? And then I had a question to a very senior scientist the other time. I said, listen, when I was a kid, I was inoculated against all kinds of diseases, BCG, DPT, and all kinds of things. So if you took the nutrient value in the inoculum and checked that and compared it to who I am today, it will bear no resemblance. But it prevented things from happening to me that makes me look what I look today. And so you're comparing not even apples and oranges, you're comparing cherries with an elephant. There's no comparison whatsoever. You have to see it in terms of what it does to soil health, how it strengthens soil biology, how it improves soil organic carbon. We just came up with a report, it's about to be published. I have had a chance to review it. We had enlisted the services of the World Agroforestry Center to do a comprehensive land degradation, put up land degradation test sites, and a comprehensive study which is coming out, which shows significant improvements in soil organic carbon by adopting natural farming. So the soil is actually improving with every passing crop cycle. And so the challenge is not as much the politicians as it is scientists who believe what they want to believe in, and which is sad, honestly.
I think, thank you. I think you've thrown out a challenge to scientists really over here to think about new ways of looking at the short versus the long term and the risks versus the return. So that's a good one. I mean, it's also interesting that you've identified for us, I think, some ingredients of the recipe for scaling over here. Political leadership, clearly very important, financing clearly very important. But the other aspect that you mentioned, sort of these behavioral nudges, recognizing that farmers learn best from each other and not through these conventional forms of training and extension that we've invested in for decades. And so this is another area where we need to see change if we want to scale, I think. And so I think it's really good to hear you reinforce that message. Okay, let's move on here. There's a question from Mr. Vivek Negi, who asks whether there is scope for economic valuation approaches like TEEB for land restoration in India, and how this can contribute to environmental policy. Does anybody have an answer to this? I have a quick answer, but I'd like to open it up to anybody else who might, amongst the speakers, who may have an answer to this.
I can give you some information, while I would certainly love to hear from others. So the quick information is that the TEEB program of UNEP is currently actually undertaking a study. It's a TEEB study on natural farming. So they're doing it actually in Andhra Pradesh. So the work is currently underway, and it is led by Pawan Sukhdev, who you would know, the current president of the board of WWF International, but more importantly, the person that conceptualized TEEB to start with in 2007. So he's the study leader, and so that's happening already in Andhra Pradesh to look at how does it help land restoration, public health, the whole gamut of issues, agri-food systems. So that's something that is currently underway.
Okay, very good. So I have a slightly different response on this. I think the valuation work that TEEB does is very good, and it raises the profile of all the issues that we forget when we don't consider these external impacts of the work that we do. But I think part of where we need to move from is recognizing that where the values are, that there are real benefits to restoration and they accrue to a large number of people. But also then trying to figure out how do you actually monetize that benefit? It's the job of saying that these benefits exist, which TEEB has done a wonderful job with, I think is the first step in the process. And the next step in the process is going where Archana is going. How do you take these values and make them something that is actually instrumental, that matters not in an abstract sense, but very specifically, so people will act based on these values? And that's where I think the global community actually has a challenge. We haven't done as good a job of taking these valuation studies and the work that we have done on the benefits and converting that into instruments for action. And that's where we need to go in the future. And I'll stop there. But I want to come back to some other questions, and I might actually jump to something that's right in front of me instead of scrolling back and forth. And this has to do with maybe partly a question for Dr. Ajay, and it has to do with sort of identification, mapping, and ownership details of land degradation, of degraded land. How do you bring together this information from advanced technologies and remote sensing data about what is happening to land to information on who owns the land? Because that's a critical part of it, right? You can't just say, let's understand the drivers, but let's forget the people who actually sit and manage the land. So what can we do to bring these two things together?
Yeah, in fact, when we try to map the land degradation, it is done at different scales, different levels. When we are doing it at reconnaissance level, say at national level or regional level, it's at very coarse scale. Now coming down, when we similarly same in the hierarchy, when we come to the state or district level, the scale is larger. Now when we want to identify the ownership and the actual action, what action should be taken on the ground and who is the ownership of the land, the scale is brought up to the level of cadastral map. And in India, the cadastral map is at around 8,000 in some state and 4,000 at some scale. So what we do large scale mapping at 10,000 scale using very high resolution satellite images, and then using GIS, that is one part of the geospatial technology, and overlay the revenue map, that is the cadastral map, which shows the land parcel boundary and the ownership, with the map map generated from satellite images showing the land degradation. That is how we identify the ownership, by taking the map to that particular scale at which the revenue maps and cadastral maps are available.
Okay.
And again, telling about the process or driver, I would like to say one thing here very general, that anything happening, whether it is good or bad on land, land records it. It gets recorded on the land. And that is what we try to pick up from the satellite images.
Right, right. Thank you. I want to move maybe to Archana right now. And there was a comment here saying there's lots of interesting presentations, but there's a link to participation of local people in land restoration. And I think, Archana, this is what you do. You are sort of this middle person in between markets and local communities. So if you could perhaps talk to two issues. So what are your biggest challenges with engaging with communities and getting them to fully participate and really benefit from all of this? And B, how do we scale this really? Anyway, let's have you address that.
Thank you, Priya. Sorry, I was disconnected in between, but I'm back again, and I hope I have not lost much of the good conversation. I think working with community, it takes a lot of time. We must understand that even if we have a great scheme of government, and if we want to implement it through the community, it takes a lot of time for any organization or any set of people to convince people about the new idea. In our case, it was slightly easier because we have been working in the same area, Northwestern Ghats, for the last 25 years. And we often used to discuss that how the conservation will bring benefits. And, when we started this fair-wide approach, that was also on a very, very small test level. And because community, even they're not articulated, or they're not coming forward and saying that, hey, we are watching you, but they all the time keep watching us. And then for this first, site, people are watching. And when we actually collected more than a couple of tons of fruits, processed them, few people got employment, then the people thought that it's okay, let's also go for it. That is one way, and you need to work also on building capacity of local people, local communities, and not only the direct beneficiaries, but the other non-beneficiaries or the community in general. Unfortunately, in many of the implementation of government schemes, what happens is the capacity building is restricted to those who are beneficiaries or those who are directly participating. But there is, a group in the village who would like to know what's happening and how directly or indirectly it is affecting them, may not be benefiting essentially. So that capacity building and continuous work and the dialogue, and you should be open that communities are asking questions to you. In our case, it was easy and possible because we were not implementing any government scheme for restoration of sacred groves or, building value chains around particular trees. So that is one side. And secondly, you need to do quite a lot of, understanding at the ground level, what's happening, whether people had this tradition of collecting certain fruits, what is their understanding of the resources, who are the champions, and can we work with them? So you really need to know the community so well, then only you can go and test some of the approaches. Because unless you know the community, you have the dialogue with them, you are not together ready to face the challenges and failures. We also faced. It is not that, we had this idea, we went and, we could do that. we tried medicinal plants cultivation as an alternative to abundant rice paddy farming in this area, but we miserably failed. That was about say 13, 14 years ago. And we realized that it is not that you bring something totally new which communities are not aware, but see if you can build around something which they know. So that is very important. And sacred groves and cultural spaces in the form of sacred groves are near heart of the people. Of course, the resource as such is degrading faster because of pressures of development and modernization. And another thing, scaling up could happen, but then your understanding of the resource has to be very strong. Like many people tell me that we saw your initiative and we would like to do it in our area, and we have a lot of Terminalia cebula or Terminalia bellerica trees. And then I asked them, how many trees you have? They said, no, I was walking 2 kilometers. And I see, that's not done. That's your passion. You want to save, you want to do something, but then you need to study, you need to do the complete research, and you need to have the resource assessments in handy with you, and then only you can really scale up. That is number one. And secondly, the most important thing is you need to have investment for scaling up, because for scaling up you need to have more resource assessments, understand more areas, go to other areas and figure out whether this could be replicable or not. Then you need to build the capacity of people, and simultaneously you also need to keep one part of your team completely directly working with the markets and trying to convince them to be part of this whole process. So it takes time, but I think yes, we can definitely scale up, and we have scaled up already. And now our supply per year is about 30 tons of processed fruits to Pakka Hubs and other companies, and even the local market we are tapping. And people have understood, that how they were linked to this resource and sacred groves, and now these are the only few giant trees they are bringing them money. So I think the whole cycle, as far as area's goal is concerned of conservation, has been completed using these market-based approaches.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And, congratulations.
The story is so good. Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me?
No, I think I tried to, tell our story in a very, very short
No,
time.
and it's a very, very good story. And I think this is the critical issue here, is that passion can't be bottled up. And if we want to scale, we need to be able to replicate what you have done very successfully in 1,000 different ways. And there are other successful stories such as yours, and all of them need to be replicated in order to scale. And I think we know and that's, I think, the part of the challenge is how to figure out what to put in when you don't have passion, so you can have 1,000 replicants or 50,000 replicants, right? And that's the big challenge. And maybe finance will fill a little bit of that gap, but not all of it. So anyway, let's but great story. Thank you. Let's move on. There's a question, I think, partly for Pradeep, perhaps, and this is from Sanpreet, who says, how do we leverage camper funds for land restoration at scale? And I think the idea being is that this money is available, and you've talked about sort of creating these mechanisms, these financial entities possibly at the country level, so that they can address the financing issue in a more integrated fashion. And maybe you can link that somehow with the fact that the camper resources are available, Pradeep.
Thank you, Priya. For us, when we really look at the global level, investing in land restoration becomes very relevant. While it has very clear ecosystem services value, of course, when we talk about food security, water, and we talk about ecosystem services, since they are, especially ecosystem services, are not captured into the benefits when we really look at to the nation or otherwise. So in UNCCD, we are looking at how do we really give value to farmers, or you can say land warriors or land champions on the ground, value for the investment into land. Especially we talk about organic soil carbon there very clearly. which I'm sure other colleagues can speak very well. But for us, financing is the key when we want to go to the scale. And when we want to go to the scale, LDN fund is just one fund at the global level. But country like India, I sincerely believe that we need a dedicated LDN equivalent fund for India. See, we are talking about 100 million hectares of degraded land. And at least 50% of that land can be easily made productive. Other land require much more investment and other things. Out of that 50 million, we are talking about 26 million target as announced by Prime Minister of India at COP14 last year. So we are talking about $300 to $500 per hectare. So like I mentioned, we are talking about $1 billion plus every year between now and 2030 to really make it happen. But that's where private sector funding has to be unlocked, and the risk involved there, the policies are not very clear. Like Priya, you mentioned also in the beginning, along with other colleagues, like Satya also mentioned, that land issues are very politicized in India. It has a lot of social implications. It has a lot of economic implications. And land laws, in myself, I have handled during my district postings with other colleagues. I have seen that how fragmented land agenda is. So smart policies with very innovative financing instrument, which should not subsidize. Somehow, I feel we should try to come towards more business models. And there are good examples around the world. I mean, let me just give you an example of China. Of course, I hope my colleagues will take it in good spirit. There's a Kabuchi Desert, and there's one alien foundation. We have seen it. I've seen it 4 years back. He's from, like, people are from Rajasthan or Gujarat or others. He's a very big, you can say, builder from Kabuchi Desert, which is Mongolia, Inner Mongolia area. He's investing a lot of his profits back into greening the deserts. But he feels it should not be a social cost. It should create value chain. It means he's creating value chain from organic farming there. Because when you green the desert, one is just to plant trees. But he has gone into more into agroforestry, where you have agriculture, medicinal plants, and value chain, and then local industry. So local jobs are being created. The funding, like $1 investment, he feels he can get easily return of $10 per that investment. So if business models are there, the smart policies are there. Another area for India could be that, of course, again, I know forest colleagues are here. Can we lease out some of those banjar lands where nothing grows as of now, where it can be community, private sector participation with government overseeing the regulatory side, where 20 years, 30 years, where that area can become green, the value addition comes, the economic returns come, and then it is on again by the government or by the economic. Ownership doesn't change. It is simply the private sector is allowed maybe as part of their CSR. And why private sector? I feel there are a number of public sectors in India, and they're looking for such innovative financing. And here in India, we have seen land degradation can be also linked with the solar technologies, because the linkage with solar gives it more business models. And most of the degraded lands have very good solar radiations. In fact, those are the deserts area, you can say, Gujarat and Rajasthan especially, of course, other parts of, and part of Haryana also. So why not we link up with other business models, with renewables, with value chain, dedicated financing, and LDN fund doesn't give you soft loan. This gives you loan at the market interest rates, but again, it gives you only for land restoration purpose. That should be the main objective. And other multiple benefits can make it more, you can say, beneficial side. So I do believe that a country like India needs a dedicated LDN fund with right smart policies, linking to that and unlocking private sector investments, especially on the CSR, but also unlocking other pension funds and others coming in more what we say build back better now when we are looking at post-COVID phase. This is a time we can unlock those opportunities and use it more for land restoration in India.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think this suggestion, this recommendation that we need a dedicated financing instrument is a really good one. And I hope maybe you folks are already thinking about how to create one, or, or UNEP is, but this is a I can't imagine that you can do the kind of scaling that we have to do without something like this. So
Yeah, can I add something to what Pradeep mentioned?
Very quickly, Satya.
Yeah. So just to give you a quick example, we did something similar, and so what everything that Pradeep said bears out actually, because we've already done it in Indonesia, in the Bukit Tigapulu forest, which is a forest about 7 times the size of the country Singapore. So there we set up something called the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility in 2016, towards the end of 2016. And it took us about a year plus, about 14 months to deliver on the first investment, which is worth $350 million. It is a partnership with Michelin. There are no government subsidies whatsoever. But as you rightly, as Pradeep rightly mentioned, and you also have mentioned, that the government played a very benign role, right from the president to his entire cabinet, that we want this to succeed. And so regulatory support was very helpful, but not much again, there was some interest, the tax deduction at source on interest and all, which is something that they worked on. But other than that, it is purely private sector. And the first tranche of 95 million was delivered in February 2018. It was raised from the capital markets, and it was raised at a cost 50% below what Michelin was itself being able to garner from its own market approaches. And so it is possible. It is degraded land. So the government gave away a land concession of 88,000 hectares of degraded land, of which 50,000 hectares is a conservation area now run by WWF International. And the other 38,000 hectares is now the world's largest sustainable rubber plantation, which becomes a horseshoe around the forest, which was being depleted. And it is the protective ring now, employs directly and indirectly 50,000 people who were predominantly those that were being used as pawns in destroying the forest. So these models are possible. And we managed to raise 15-year money, because that's what you need to be able to save the forests or bring them back. So it is possible, but it requires a lot of patience, a lot of hard work. There are no easy solutions. Nobody is waiting there with a purse of money just to hand over to make it happen. You really have to build a partnership of well-meaning, passionate champions that will come together to reduce themselves a little bit, but collectively become much taller.
Yeah. Another example, another good example possibly is the tree fund that has been set up by the Conservancy in Africa. So this is a blended finance mechanism which brings in some philanthropy to help with kind of the development of these plantations or agroforestry schemes, because you do need the kind of capacity building that Archana was talking about, the initiation, all of that work has to be done. And then there is private sector money, which tries to increase its own returns on investment, but also results in sort of private sector income for the livelihoods of these communities that participate in this. So I think these institutional innovations, again, they're not going to be easy, but they are required. Right? If you want to scale, if you want to stay small, it's okay. We can do piecemeal here and there. But if you want to scale, I think we need to figure out what the legalities are that may be barriers to these institutional innovations, that India has to forge ahead on this. I think this is critical. There are a couple more questions. I'm going to try to move to Dr. Khosla quickly, but there were a couple of early questions on the Finance Commission that I'd like to quickly address and how to incentivize. I think one of the members of the audience said, well, there's this money from the Finance Commission, but it really depends on what happens on the ground, and there's not much, and a complete agreement. The idea is simply to say the money is available. Now, what happens to the money is where the rubber hits the road, right? And this is where the negotiations, the pressure, the discussions with the state governments really, really matters. And how to take this money, it's available but not captured. It's sort of like the TEEP studies. The benefits are there, but you can't capture them. You've got to figure out the mechanisms for capturing this money to use it to incentivize agroforestry and other value addition related investments that can lead to restoration. So that's a job that is ahead of us. One piece of work that we're doing at the Conservancy, which we've just started, there's a lot that TNC India is doing, but on the policy front, we're also looking at these variations in state policies that may either incentivize or disincentivize agroforestry. Some of it may be tax policies completely outside the forestry sector or even the land sector that may act as an incentive for smallholders to participate in growing trees or restoring their lands in some fashion. So to sort of understand from the policy down to the capacity and the financing is, I think these are all kind of the good challenges that we need to be able to pick up. I have one last question that I'm going to identify for anybody who wants to address this. And this has to do with the silos, you know, that the land space is so siloed in different, by different ministries, different interest groups, and whether the biodiversity, I'm sorry, I'm looking for this. Yes, here it is from Sangeeta Agarwal. How to make the different agencies work together by breaking silos. Could the Biodiversity Act in particular, does it create the policy space for making this happen? Does anybody have an answer to this? So bringing in the Biodiversity Act into the land restoration space. I'm not sure.
Can I?
Yes, please, Archana, go ahead.
I think, thank you, Sangeeta, for raising this question. I think there is certainly an opportunity to deal with, you know, silos with the land issues through Biodiversity Act. But I think we all are, you know, all the states, they are, you know, trying to understand this Biodiversity Act and how do we bring it, you know, in reality and make best use of it to deal with the land issues. You know. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We need to, I think we need to stop there. Pradeep wants, I want to give Dr. Khosla the time. Go ahead, Pradeep. Do you have a quick response?
Yeah, very quick on this. I think the time has come. We need a new social contract for land. I think that's what we call. And I think we must have an integrated national level land restoration policy, which should cater to all, because that's where the biodiversity of climate or jobs or incomes or food security, I think so we must take some integrated view, but still I feel it must permeate into national development planning process itself, like Satya mentioned earlier. And we have to take some creative tools there to bring it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you, panelists, and everybody who's participated thus far. Now it's time for closing remarks. Dr. Ashok Khosla, it's a pleasure to invite a leader such as you with all your experience over the last many years. Give us your words of wisdom and experience.
I don't know about wisdom or experience, but I would certainly like to share a few words with you. I'm not going to try and summarize the wonderful and very rich conversation we've had. We've covered so much ground on policy issues, on finance, on the economics, on markets and potential use of technologies, and even the political economy, the distributive aspects. And, you know, Satya gave us a terrific example of what he called, you know, opportunities and challenges. The challenge is not just scale, it's scale with speed. We've got to find ways in which we can solve problems within our lifetimes and not wait for another century, by which time things will have sorted themselves out anyway. The point about it is that, as Satya suggested, there are ways in which new approaches, new technical approaches, new financial approaches can create something in a sense out of nothing. When you bring the right ingredients together. Pradeep covered a great deal of area, particularly related to ecosystem services and particularly to jobs, which I think is really the critical issue of everything we do. I'm interested in restoration because more than 10 years ago, I was in fact the chair of the meeting in Bonn, which launched the Bonn Challenge. So I have a sort of proprietary interest in the whole area of restoration. And restoration to me is not simply bringing back Mother Earth. It's not about just a Bhumi Puja. It's about the whole issue of human living and civilization. And restoration is a critical element of that, because we really managed in the last century to enormously destroy a very large part of our natural resources. The part of the reason for the predicament we're in is short-termism. A large part of it has been caused by communities, by households even on the one hand, and nations and businesses, governments, taking decisions which were not always in the long-term interests of society. So one basic issue that I think we've got to understand is that there are limits to the kinds of solutions we find. When we talk glibly about private sector, we've got to recognize the private sector has its motivations. And most of those motivations are driven by very short-term interests. And so when we talk about private sector, there are different kinds. The big companies, they can be party to this because they're the ones who create demand for the products of the land. And maybe we can get them to modify their demand by exerting pressure as consumers or as governments, as policymakers. But by and large, I don't see big private sector being part of the answer to local solutions. Local solutions need small, local private sector, the MSMEs, the local businesses, the local households. And it seems to me that we've got to be very careful when we talk about things generically. There are the very different kinds of attributes that each of these sectors has. We had a very solid talk from Priya about, particularly about the financing systems, and from Dr. Ajay about the incredible possibilities that technology makes for efficiency and for better resource use. And I think all of these really were very enlightening. What Archana was talking about is what I do for a living every day, which is how do we do community-based land regeneration methods. Now, she's done a lot of work on the ecological and the, if you like, the biological end of things. And my organization has done a great deal of work on the more mechanical, the more physical, the physics-based rather than the biology-based sort of issues, which include a lot of economics, institutional design, and so on. And what I thought I'd spend the last 3 or 4 minutes that I have with you is really to say that my understanding over these 35, 40 years that we've been working on these issues is that we do have to recognize it's a systems problem. It's a systemic issue. When you talk about silos, you're basically saying we're not bringing together different parts of the system in a way that they synergize each other and give us the greatest benefit. And when you talk about systems, sometimes the things that are within the system are very large. For example, not a single person in such an incredibly rich conversation mentioned the fact that a very large part and a growing part, and in the next 20, 30 years, unless we change things, possibly a predominant part of the pressure on land will be the making of houses. Not because of the land they occupy, but because of the materials that go into making them. One brick, one burnt brick takes up more than a kilogram, 1.5 kilograms of soil, of topsoil, of clay, which is primarily needed for food production, plus 2 kilograms of wood and cow dung. Now, when you add all these things up, you have a whole bunch of other problems and potential solutions to these, which lie outside the domains that we've been talking about. Going out there and planting trees is only one way of saving land. Changing our cropping patterns, transforming our chemical agriculture into natural, organic, or whatever else agriculture are ways, are very important ways, maybe even 80% of the work that needs to be done has been covered. But there are many things to do with urbanization, to do with infrastructure development, like roads and bridges and airports and dams, all of these. And the answers to many of these actually exist that don't threaten land. Water harvesting structures at the local level can be far, far better than large-scale irrigation systems from the point of view of protecting land and land resources, for example. So we need to think a little beyond the way we are thinking about what is causing the problem that we're addressing and what could be the solutions. The solutions for the brick problem could well be alternative building materials, subsoil materials, industrial wastes, power station wastes, energy wastes. We've done a huge amount of work on fly ash based building materials, mining waste materials, and so on. So basically, we've got to recognize that some of the solutions that we're looking for actually lie outside our sectors. They lie somewhere in industrial policy or in housing policy and so on. And they are big. They will become bigger and bigger as urbanization picks up speed. So that's one whole set of issues. Think systems and look at not only the problems, but also the solutions that lie outside the domain of forests and land. The second is the actors. We talked a lot about governments, about communities, and those are really important, and indeed business. I think we're missing things like faith-based organizations. I believe that there is room to mobilize communities and people in ways that we haven't really adequately addressed. And we can see from recent experience that faith-based religious organizations can have a huge impact, which may or may not be permanent, only because they have not been able basically to do things in the right way. But if we partner with them technologically, etc., we would be much better off. There's also in our civilization, in our culture, a fear of being taken for a ride. I've never understood why we plant trees that don't produce fruits and good things for people. I've always been given the answer, people will steal the fruits. Well, why not? The question always arises to me that in Spain, if you walk down the street in Barcelona or in Valencia, all the streets are lined with orange trees, with fruit trees. And people do pick them up and eat them. But they're that much healthier for it. And it seems to me that we're very, very conducive in our thinking about what is a good way to regenerate our economies, our resource bases, and so on. Okay, now that my time is running out, let me just say that one basic issue that is underlying all this is the role of civil society. If you want scale, you really do have to have mobilized large numbers of people. And the only sector of society that really is able to, except possibly for votes and for taxes, the only sector that can really mobilize large numbers is local organizations, civil society, NGOs, community-based organizations. And India is so fortunate in having such an incredibly rich body of civil society from historical times that it is a pity to see right now that it is being pressed to the wall for no good reasons at all. The crisis with COVID recently in the last 6 months has opened up a little bit of a window for them because they've been seen by society to have been producing results that nobody really recognized before. But we need to understand that without all the actors, all the sectors, not just government and business, but basically academia, media, and all the NGOs, the civil society, are needed. And frankly, I don't think that this conversation spent enough time on putting the onus on that part of the economy that is going to have to be mobilized by people and mobilizes people to mobilize themselves. So it's a big area for us, and I hope that you will all see how important it is. I want to thank both TNC and UNEP for having joined us in this effort, and I thought it was a terrific conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khosla. Very important points about really scanning the horizon, that we need to be horizon scanning and look outside our narrow windows to know what's coming at us and to be able to figure out how to capture what's coming at us and to bring all the traditional and non-traditional partners together. And I think this webinar is part of that effort because part of the issue with civil society, which is such a great asset in India, particularly elsewhere too, is being able to build a kind of consensus so that we can move forward together. And I think these kinds of webinars, maybe this is a small COVID blessing in a way, amongst all the unfortunate things that have emerged, is this ability to coalesce people together who might not have gathered otherwise. But anyway, those are all good things to be thinking about as we work together to restore India's lands. Thank you all so very much. Thank you, UNEP, Development Alternatives, TNC. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this session and being part of this conversation. Onward, folks. Good luck. Stay in touch. And namaste.
Namaste.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you.
And the organizers. Let me please thank the organizers. They've done a great job of pulling it together. Thank you very much, folks who are behind the scenes.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.